Hello, everyone. My name is Manas Chawla. I'm the CEO and founder of London Politica, and today I have the real honor and privilege of being joined by Dr. Shashi Tharoor here on the sidelines of the Bled Strategic Forum. Dr. Tharoor, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Manas.
You've just come off of a panel, a sort of relatively crowded one with various other ministers and political leaders. As you look out to sort of the world and you try to address the question of emerging multipolarity, what do you see as the biggest challenge going forward?
Well, I think we're looking at a world that is actually in the middle of a kind of paradox because at the top level, there's increasing signs of an emerging bipolarity. That is, the Chinese rising up to compete at many levels with the US at the global stage. And then at the next tier down, there's sort of serious efforts at multipolarity. But it's very different from what we saw during the Cold War, when you had two opposing poles, a binary kind of division, and then the non-aligned movement that stayed aloof from both. What we're seeing now instead is almost typified by the Indian experience, where a certain amount of geopolitical promiscuity has come about, where India is sort of along with the US and the West in groupings like the Quad or the I2U2, the new grouping of Israel, India, US, and UAE, on the one hand, and with the Chinese and the Russians and BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization on the other. And it's both in the sort of G20, which does the macroeconomic management of the world, and it's also in the G77, which is kind of the global trade union of developing countries. So it's trying to do everything at the same time, be all things to all people, which is different in a sense from the old non-aligned concept. The non-aligned concept is you weren't part of any alliance involving either of the superpowers. Now you're in sort of partnership with both superpowers, or one superpower and one almost, there as an aspiring superpower. And the question is, if they are going to themselves become more and more bipolar, where do you fit in and where do other countries fit in? I was a great votary of what I tried to dub not non-alignment, but multi-alignment. That is that, we meet with the Russians and the Chinese in something called RIC. Then we add the Brazilians and the South Africans and we get BRICS. Then we take out the Russians and the Chinese and we have IPSA for South-South cooperation, to which we add the Chinese but not the Russians, and we get BASIC for environmental negotiations. And I think India wasn't in these groupings merely because its name began with that indispensable element in every acronym, a vowel, but because it really had something to give and something to gain from these partnerships. And so multi-alignment seemed to make sense. But that made sense in a world where there was only one superpower and everybody else was trying to play the best they could with each other. Now suddenly, with this emerging bipolarity at the top, how long is this going to be viable? How long can we afford to play both sides? And I think in our case, it's compounded by the complication that the Chinese are sitting on our border and have actually killed 20 of our soldiers just 3 years ago. So how do we pretend, as it were, to be equally friendly with both sides when one has been distinctly unfriendly to us?
Yeah. One framing I've seen of this sort of kind of emerging context is the idea of geopolitical swing states. The idea that countries like India, but also say the Emirates or Saudi Arabia, have effectively disentangled the economic, political, security, and other dimensions of their foreign policy. They can do trade with the Chinese, but security and military with the Americans, and political cooperation with, say, the Europeans. What are the sort of consequences of that? Firstly, but secondly, I mean, how worried are you of this general framing of bipolarity and the idea that even if countries are charting an independent path, they're effectively still a swing state. The idea that they still must sort of revolve along one or the other axis of the pendulum.
Yeah, the problem is precisely that the concept of this geopolitical swing state made sense when it was possible to do that swinging. But if you're increasingly being called upon to choose, then it becomes problematic to be on both sides. As I said, ours is compounded by our own geopolitical realities. China has engaged in hostile action for 40 odd years. We had a very effective modus vivendi where both militaries would patrol along the disputed frontier, but no shots were ever fired in anger. There was no violence between them for over 40 odd years, 40, almost 50, frankly, 46 years, 44 years before suddenly in 2020, the Chinese decided that in 26 of the 65 patrolling points that both sides had access to, that they weren't going to give the Indians access anymore. They're going to park enduring military installations in 26 of these points. Now, that was a distinctly unilateral and unfriendly act. And when the Indians, in all innocence, went there unarmed to say, "What are you doing? You pack up and leave. You're not supposed to be staying on here." They were pushed off a cliff, and 20 of them died, and many were rather savagely injured. What turned out to be a non sort of ammunition laden engagement, but one that caused 20 deaths on the Indian side and presumably a somewhat smaller number on the Chinese. Now, it was most unfortunate that this should have been provoked by a direct neighbor that is also at the same time seeking to be a geopolitical player globally. But that's the situation that we in India are facing and trying to confront. And at the moment, it seems to me to severely limit our options for engagement with the Chinese. Until and unless status quo ante is restored, that modus vivendi is essentially ceased to be viable.
Yeah. I mean, very much the elephant practically not in the room, given that there's a handful of Chinese delegates at this conference,
Yeah.
is China. It comes up in sort of every second sentence. We have a foreign minister in India right now, who, if I'm not mistaken, spent a considerable amount of time in Beijing. What do you? I mean, presumably that should give us a more sort of accurate, worldview of approaching China. Is that something you agree with? And what do you think India can do better in its foreign policy with China?
Well, I think he as an individual certainly has good awareness of what's going on. He's been a skillful and effective foreign minister. But the issue goes beyond individuals. I mean, for example, it seems absurd that our trade dependence on China has actually worsened in the 3 years since they killed our soldiers. So we now have $100 billion deficit of trade between China and India, and essentially something like 90% of the mutual trade is one way from the Chinese to us. And our businesses seem to be unable to wean themselves off Chinese imports. So we've taken sort of slap on the wrist kind of measures like banning Chinese apps and closing down TikTok in India.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the more substantive dependence? There's no really good answer there. And I think if you say, what should India do better? One thing we should do better is show the Chinese that we can find other sources of supply for some of these things that we seem to be currently showing the Chinese we are totally dependent on them to give us. And we should be diversifying very much our trade and reducing dramatically our imports from China. That would send a more effective signal.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't, on the one hand, be taking a tough line geopolitically and saying you must restore the status quo ante.
Yeah.
And then on economics, if you're groveling, you're not going to get very far on the geopolitical stuff either.
Mm-hmm. Well, allow me to push back a little bit on that, because I completely agree that there's very good national security reasons to, redo our supply chains given the dependence on China. That said, increasingly that turns into a sort of economic protectionism, which is very hard to disentangle from the more fervent political nationalism and the brand of it that we've seen in the last few years. Are there risks posed by that, and how would you address that?
Well, this is one of the phenomena I was talking about in Bled. I didn't use the word because we were so strapped for time, all of us. But the idea that the old idea of the collective is now in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
People are in a much more Westphalian world reasserting their sovereignties, reasserting their nationalism. And that's coincided with the rise of nationalist strongmen in very many countries. Whether it's a British leader getting Britain out of the EU through Brexit, whether it's Donald Trump wanting to make America great again and then pulling the US out of WHO and threatening other kinds of unilateral actions, whether it's people like Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, Mr. Orban in Hungary, or for that matter, Mr. Modi in India, who portray themselves as more authentic representatives of their nations and of their people than the allegedly ruthless cosmopolitans they're seeking to displace and have displaced. With all of this, you're suddenly seeing a greater assertion of national sovereignty at the expense of international cooperation and multilateralism. And that's, I think, a genuine worry. And certainly both the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis have demonstrated anew that multilateralism is in trouble. At the pandemic, nothing worked. It was every nation for itself. Today, Britain's in the position of having to throw away vast quantities of expired or expiring vaccines
Hmm.
that it hoarded 3 times more than it needed for its own people at a time when people in Africa were waiting desperately for vaccines at the peak of the pandemic. So, and Britain is not the only country in that position. Other prosperous Western countries did the same thing. Equally within the West, when the pandemic first broke out, the first casualty was all the bromides they've been teaching us about international cooperation. Borders went up inside the Schengen countries. The Schengen visa ceased to have any relevance. When Italy became the first European country to experience the virus, bang came down the borders of Europe. And instead of trying to rush in solidarity to their victims, it was all about how do we keep ourselves out of Italy and keep the Italians away from us, that sort of thing. And it was all every nation for itself throughout the pandemic. And when it came to the international institutions, WHO was completely enthralled to the Chinese narrative. They wanted to send experts to China at the beginning of January 2020, when the virus was first reported. The Chinese simply refused them visas. There was nothing they could do about it. So, what will happen when the next pandemic comes along? Will we have a situation where the international mechanisms are better prepared to recognize a danger for the world when it first begins, to identify it and to agree on measures to tackle it? Will they be able to send experts to the next country where they believe a virus has originated without that country exercising the nationalist right to prevent the experts from coming, as China did? I mean, these are questions to which there are no real satisfactory answers.
Hmm.
We know what ought to happen, but we also know that many of our international institutions are relatively weak. We also know that many of them are dominated by the powerful member states, either permanent members of the Security Council or the bigger donors to some of the specialized agencies. And we also know that the individual executive heads of these agencies are very much dependent upon these powerful states for their own re-election, and that again limits their freedom of action. So where do we get effectively robust multilateral institutions to deal with the next pandemic? Similarly, in Ukraine, we had 7 weeks of the Brits and the Americans screaming from the rooftops that an invasion was imminent. Where was the UN Secretary General? Could he get on a plane and go to Moscow and ask what were the Kremlin's minimum irreducible demands to prevent this happening, and then go to Kiev and see if he can negotiate a solution? Um, I mean, I was in the UN when Kofi Annan, when Bill Clinton first threatened to bomb Baghdad, and Kofi got on a plane and went to Baghdad, and I was in Baghdad with him, so I can tell you that it was an act of enormous moral courage, but it used the political platform of the UN to a good purpose. And though the purpose wasn't enduring, he got 6 or 9 months of peace for the Baghdad
Hmm.
for Baghdad and for Iraq. But then the next transgression by Saddam, and the bombs did begin to fall. And this time, there was no question of the UN Secretary General trying to go again, because he was told by the big powers, once is enough, and now we're bombing, so stay away. But at least there was a chance given to peace for once, and it lasted for some time. Tomorrow, what happens if a permanent member of the Security Council decides it wants to take military action? Will the Secretary General just say, "I don't have the power to act"? In which case, what's the UN good for at the end of the day? You're seeing a situation like Ukraine playing out, and the UN is supposed to be the world, the organization that was supposed to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The scourge of war must be pretty painfully felt right now by a large number of Ukrainians, not to mention the 5 or 6 million refugees who fled the country because of the war. So I raise these questions not because I want to poo poo multilateralism. On the contrary, it's because I believe in multilateralism as the best refuge of our common humanity, that I want to see governments go beyond the ought and coming down to the is. I want governments not to just spout pieties at forums like Bled. I want governments to actually say, we will do this and that the next time around. We'll empower the multilateral system to act better. Frankly, nobody's saying that. They're all talking about we have to do this, we have to do that, but they'll never actually do it until there's a global cataclysm. That's what worries me.
I think with some of the, I mean, just to pick up on one point you mentioned there, which really resonates with me, there are plenty of senior executives of the United Nations who can't effectively do the job they should be doing on paper simply because they're hamstrung by the sort of power asymmetry that lies underneath the sort of Westphalian sovereignty on the surface. And certain people come to mind who may have been regarded as too activist to take up the role of Secretary General not too long ago. Uh, I mean, so I mean, you say countries shouldn't simply, spout words of piety, and they should really do something concrete and actionable to reform the system. India has been vying for a P5 seat, permanent seat on the UN Security Council, for years, if not decades now, and obviously that decision, that nothing can happen on that unless all the P5 agree to do that.
And
Uh,
it's not just the P5. I mean, I was in the
yeah,
UN when then Secretary General Boutros Ghali said in 1992 that he wanted UN Security Council reform done and dusted by the golden jubilee of the organization, the 50th anniversary due in 95. Well, the 50th has come and gone, the 60th anniversary has come and gone, the 70th anniversary has come and gone, and so has the 75th. And there is no sign at all
yeah,
of Security Council reform. So I think it's very clear that the UN has a lot of member states who don't want to dilute their existing entrenched powers. And there are other member states who are complicit because there's a two-stage process to amend the charter. You first need a General Assembly resolution with 2/3 of the members
correct.
signing on. That's 128 countries out of 193. And then you need that to be ratified, that formula, whatever it is, to be ratified by 2/3 of the member states, including all 5 permanent members. And that's where the permanent members get a veto. So for the moment, the permanent members are sitting pretty, while the rest of the member states go around in circles for
Yeah,
25 years and don't agree on a formula. And when they do finally agree on a formula, that's when, because ratification is a parliamentary procedure, all it'll take is for one American senator to say, I won't bring this to a vote.
yeah,
Or for the Chinese, if they don't like, for example, India or Japan coming on it, the Chinese could well say, oh, our parliament isn't agreeing. We all know what that's worth, but they could say it, and there's nothing much you can do. So it doesn't look very hopeful. And what I worry about with all of this indefinite um, shirking
hmm
of Security Council reform, what I really worry about is that we're going to end up in a situation where the UN itself loses credibility as the institution the world turns to when these crises occur. And there's possibly ready made an alternative waiting in the form of the G20, because all the countries who can't get on the UN Security Council are on the G20, and they have already become a rather significant organization on the macroeconomic issues of the world. And there's nothing really preventing them from also getting into the macro geopolitics of the world because they don't have a charter to tie their hands.
yeah.
There is no rule that says they can and cannot do something. And they can easily use political clout to do that. And I just wonder now if the world is going to go that way, what becomes of the UN itself?
Yeah. I mean, all the countries that are in the G20 and possibly not happy with the status of power they have form the BRICS, and all the countries not currently in the BRICS that really, think they deserve a seat on the table as of in a few months might possibly be in the BRICS. With the sort of widening of multilateral institutions and all this talk about, coming up with global South institutions of sort of developing economies to counter the sort of Western dominance in the multilateral system, do you see anything wrong with the sort of dilution, perhaps that some critics might argue that widening the club brings?
No, it's not. I mean, I wouldn't worry so much about the dilution, but I'm not sure how exactly it's going to work in practice. In other words, um, is China really part of the global South anymore? I mean, they're a developed country for all practical purposes. And is it really economics that they're concerned about in this grouping, or are they actually looking at constituting a sort of new bloc in the emerging bipolar confrontation with the West? And if that's what they really want to do, with China and Russia at its head, what on earth is India doing there? Does it really want to remain there? India wanted, I think, to see BRICS as an economic alternative for the global South. But it's rapidly in danger of turning into something else. And I think we have to look at this very carefully. As far as the emergence of multilateral institutions are concerned, you're actually mixing up two terms, Manas. These are plurilateral institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Multilateralism implies a certain generality, a certain universalism. The UN and the WHO and so on are multilateral bodies. BRICS is a plurilateral body, and there are many, many plurilateral bodies around the world, regional, sub-regional organizations of a limited number of countries, confined either by geography or purpose. Um, I still think there's no real substitute for the universality of multilateralism, which is the one thing that gets every country around the common table on issues that, frankly, what Kofi Annan used to call the problems without passports that cross all borders. Climate change is one very good example of that. Human rights is another. Terrorism is a third. And indeed, many of the global economic issues are a fourth. Issues which require, by definition, solutions that transcend all national boundaries. You can't fence off your own climate in the sky, and the solutions too will have to transcend frontiers. So for that, there is no alternative but a UN type body. A regional body can only do so much, or a plurilateral body with 5 or 10 or even 11 members, as the new BRICS is going to have from January. There's a limit to how much it can do.
We've spoken about some scary things there. You know, the future of the multilateral order being in flux and lots of these unresolved questions about how we do diplomacy over the most basic of issues, many of which are effectively collective action problems.
Yep.
To take a complete sort of 180 from that, what makes you optimistic about the future?
I wish I could say I was optimistic. I mean, I'm the kind of optimist who defines optimism as regarding the future with uncertainty. The pessimist says everything's going to hell in a handbasket, you can forget about it, we're doomed, and so on. I'm not a pessimist. But I'm not an optimist in the old-fashioned sense that, you know, Panglossian world, everything's going to be fine, best of all possible worlds. No, that's not me. I say we still have to do a lot of things, get a lot of things right, and we could still salvage the situation. And that's the kind of optimist I am.
Dr. Tharoor, thank you so much for taking the time.
Pleasure talking to you, Manas.